Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who are returning. Welcome to those who are coming and joining us for the first time. My name is Sandra Smith, and I am the faculty chair of the program in criminal justice and co-organizer of the series, along with Katie Naples Mitchell, program director of the program in criminal justice. So today is the fifth event of our series that focuses on abolition. And today's focus will be what we've described as toward prison abolition, redress, repair, and transforming harm. I kind of wanted to start our discussion by showing you a slide that many of you have probably seen before, which shows the historic rise in rates of incarceration in the U.S. over the past 100 years, but also projected figures based on rates of recent decline. And so what this chart shows us is that there has been a significant decline, roughly 25% in incarceration rates in state and federal prisons since about 2009 or so, with expectation though that it will take, given this rate, the rate of decline that we've seen, it will take about another 75 years before we reach the levels of or rates of incarceration that we experienced before mass incarceration became a thing in this country. So at this current pace, it would take it would be almost 2100 before we would see rates that were equivalent to what we saw in the early 1970s. The problem, of course, is that rates of incarceration have begun to rebound since about 2021, 2022. And so it's unclear that that we will even achieve the rates or get to the level that we think is possible if we were to continue at the current rate. So what seems clear in this whole discussion is that despite some of the recent increases and improvements in rates of incarceration, that there's one major issue that gets in the way and will continue to get in our way of dealing with decarcerating in the short term or longer, and that is the issue of violence or violent crime. It represents a major, significant percentage of folks who are held in state and federal prisons. The majority of folks who are held for violent offenses. Most of the reforms that have taken place among folks who have been convicted and incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. Those have been offenses around which we have been willing to reform the system and address issues of incarceration. But what seems very clear is that unless we deal with the question of violent crime, we will never really be able to end mass incarceration in this country. So we were really excited to both ask and have accepted our invitation to Danielle Sered to join us to have a conversation about what it would look like to engage in alternatives to incarceration where violent offenses are concerned. Danielle Sered envisioned, launched, and directs Common Justice. She leads the project's efforts locally and nationally to develop and advance practical and groundbreaking solutions to violence that advance racial equity, meets the needs of those who are harmed, and do not rely on incarceration. Before planning the launch of Common Justice, Danielle served as the deputy director of the Vera Institute of Justice's Adolescent Reentry Initiative, a program for young men returning from incarceration on Rikers Island. And prior to joining Vera, she worked at the Center for Court Innovation's Harlem Community Justice Center, where she has led its program for court-involved and recently incarcerated youth. And Ashoka Fellow and Stoneleigh Fellow. Danielle received her BA from Emory University and her master's degree from New York University and Oxford University, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Her book, which is an incredible document that argues for a move away from incarceration and towards other or alternative measures, including restorative justice practices, was honored with the award for journalism from the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice and selected by the National Book Foundation for its Literature for Justice recognition. She's been widely cited in many venues, and so I won't go into that. I'll just thank Danielle for being willing to join us today to discuss her book, but also just the incredible insights that come from it. If you've not read Until We Reckon, I really cannot encourage you to do so more strongly. It is an incredible read. It is a book that inspires. It is a book that informs. It is a book that makes you feel like there are pathways forward beyond incarceration that will really help us to resolve many of the issues that we have. So we are really excited to have Danielle join us today. Danielle, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. What an extraordinary welcome.
So let's start with a question about the use of jails and prisons to help us resolve problems related to violence. Many argue that we can't abolish jails and prisons because despite being imperfect as they are, as much harm as they cause, they actually serve a valuable function in society. Through incapacitation, they protect us from harm doers and including and perhaps especially people who are violent, and they also deter crime. So where violent crime is concerned, what's wrong with this argument? Can you speak to the failures of incarceration to address problems like violent crime?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for the introductory framing. I think it's important when we look at, I came of age in Chicago in the late 80s and early 90s, and that moment where the graph turns almost vertical was a moment of so much loss and so much pain. And a moment where that is like still the source of so much grief. And it coincided with a time of so much violence and so much harm and so much of that grief as well. And so, I think it's important to be present with the underlying reality that drives that and to think of how we push that curve down at the same kind of rate in the same sort of shape at which it grew. So the problem with our attachment to prison, even for violence, I believe there are moral problems with it. I believe that putting human beings in cages where we know they are likely to be assaulted, to be degraded, to be sexually assaulted, where we know they will be isolated from their loved ones and their communities, where we know they will suffer the kind of harms that only exacerbate underlying traumas. I believe all of that is a heavy moral weight for any society to be worthy to bear. And I don't believe that the United States has earned its worthiness in that way. To do that, I think we would have to be a more decent, more ethical, less hypocritical, more honest nation than we've ever been. But even that aside, like philosophy aside, I believe that if you care about ending violence and you care about crime survivors, there is no logical conclusion but for you to become fiercely, unequivocally committed to ending our use of prison. And so I say that because prison fails. Prison is criminogenic, meaning two similarly situated people, one of whom is incarcerated, the other whom is not. The person incarcerated becomes likelier than the other to commit more crime. The vast majority of people incarcerated, even for crimes of violence, come home. They are not disappeared from earth, though we often behave as though what's happening. We talk about people going away as though away is a place. But people return, people remain in relationship, like they belong to us still, even if we have locked them somewhere else. And what we know from the overwhelming evidence is that prison is likelier to produce more harmful outcomes. It has recidivism rates in some places upwards of 80%. If common justice had an 80% failure rate, we would not all be together today. Like I would not have been on your invitation list. Lovely though my book may have been, right? Like we have to be good at what we do. Prison is terrible at what it does. And for those of us who study and are in the business of ending violence, it makes sense. We know the core drivers of violence are structural. They are poverty, they are inequity, even more than poverty. They are poor social service infrastructure, poor hospital and other care infrastructure. Prisons only exacerbate those structural drivers by pulling the resources that could otherwise be used to do the things that actually stop violence. But even on the individual level, we know that the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So we've baked into our core responses to violence precisely the things that we know generate it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline and acting surprised when the flames rage higher. I come to this work as somebody with deep concerns about the racialized violence that happens in and through and by our prison systems. But I come to this work as a survivor too, as a survivor of rape, as someone who has lost loved ones to murder, as a survivor of assault, and as someone who is deeply invested in ending violence. And one of the entities I hold accountable for the pain that I endured is our prison system. Because had we invested in things that worked, had we not fueled the flames, like I might have been protected. The people I buried when I was still a teenager, like my peers I buried, I might have graduated with them rather than gone to their funerals, like had a shirt with their face on it because they graduated, not because we grieved them. And so I think our commitment to ending mass incarceration need not and cannot only be rooted in our commitment to ending the brutality it inflicts on the people who are in it. And I think just because our current solutions are not yet to the scale of incarceration, that's evidence in our investment, not evidence about efficacy, right? That reflects our moral priorities. Like people talk about budgets as moral documents. Our budgets are morally bereft in this nation and have long been. And so when we know we have an approach that fails and causes harm, it is our duty to develop approaches that work, to resource approaches that work, and to stop doing those things. So if you said to me, someone has an infection, our only solution is to amputate. And I said to you, like, one, is there something we can do other than amputating? Because amputating causes harm and people could bleed out. And even if they don't, people are harmed by that. Like there's a loss in it. That would be a reasonable question for me to ask. And if I said it would be good for us to develop a way to reduce infection so that we need not amputate, you wouldn't think I was a crazy radical. You'd be like, that's an appropriate approach for us as a people. And so I think for me, in order for me to consider someone an abolitionist, the question isn't like, do you think we should open all prison doors tomorrow? That's not the threshold question to qualify. There are some abolitionists who'd say yes to that and many who wouldn't. The question is like, if we could keep one another safe without prisons, would you still want prisons? And if the answer to that is no, like welcome aboard, and welcome to the project of bringing our nation into like writer and writer relationship, with the prospect of actually ever becoming a genuine multiracial democracy.
So we've managed as a country, some states more than others, to address our skyrocketing incarceration rates by releasing or reducing the likelihood that people who have engaged in nonviolent offenses are incarcerated, or they're incarcerated for shorter periods of time. So we've been able to move ourselves in a direction where we are willing to not incarcerate or be less punitive towards folks who've engaged in nonviolent offenses. But we seem to be struggling a great deal with this question of violence and how to address it. So what are the challenges, broadly speaking, that get in the way of us dealing with violence in a different way that will help us to both address harm much more effectively, but also in the process bring down our high rates of incarceration?
Yeah, I think one of the first challenges comes from having insufficiently resourced the alternative approaches that would work instead. Like with lower level crimes, you can just say like, leave people alone. That's a really reasonable policy position. Like just never mind is a fine policy position for a lot of crimes, and actually like far more efficient, more cost effective, more moral than most of our policy decisions about lower level crimes. With violence, you can't say just leave people alone. And so there has to be like a commensurate investment in the things we could do instead that would prevent harm and also respond to harm when it happens in such a way that prevents further harm. And so that lack of investment in that infrastructure is important. I think our movement has made a mistake in talking about prisons as ineffective, as opposed to talking about prisons as harmful. Like if prisons are just ineffective, then the problem is mostly for the people who are in them. You know, if prisons are harmful, right, not just to the people there, but if they are generative of violence, if they are criminogenic, then they're a problem for all of us. Like part of how I come to seeking the abolition of prisons is by saying, I want an end to violence. And so I look everywhere in my culture that generates violence and seek to eliminate it. Like if there's a nasty smell in your house, you look for where the smell is coming from and you take it out of your house. And I understand prison in that way. I understand it as a threat to our shared safety. And I think too often we talk about prison as though it is less successful at what it's supposed to do than ideal, and not as something that's generative of violence. And that changes our orientation to something. And then the last thing is where all of this comes from, right? That prisons are the grandchildren of slavery, right? That we go from slavery through convict leasing, through all these codes, through like red line, we go from there into mass incarceration, that we have a history in this country rooted in a narrative about the inherent criminality and otherness of Black people, that we have never uprooted, we have never fully addressed, we have never accounted for the harm we cause based in that narrative, and we continue to repeat and ingrain it. And so the part of why we are so fixed on a particular kind of punishment of violence is, as a nation, having not answered the question of whether or not we believe unequivocally in the full humanity of Black people. Like, that is not a question we have answered as a country. And it shows up in our policy. And we haven't addressed those historical harms, and we haven't addressed that underlying narrative nearly sufficiently clearly enough. And until we do that, we'll continue to do iterations of this. And it'll shapeshift as it has for hundreds of years, rooted in the same like dehumanizing lies. And so I think from the sort of most granular to the biggest, I think those are our biggest barriers.
Thank you so much for that. So now you offer the restorative justice movement and related practices as one pathway, safety and justice, because such practices adhere to 4 essential principles, and that's being survivor-centered, being accountability-based, safety-driven, and racially equitable. Perhaps you can address the following kind of set of questions through the lens of your experience with common justice. The first is around one of the critiques that you level against the criminal legal system itself and its inability, essentially, and perhaps unwillingness to address survivors' needs. In general, what do survivors need? And how does the criminal legal system fail to address their needs? And then what does restorative justice, how does it center the needs of survivors in ways that the criminal legal system doesn't and that people need when trying to heal?
I think there's one set of needs that survivors have, which are to be able to ask questions, to know why something happened, to know if it was a real gun, to say F you, to say, what would you have done if I fought back? What if I didn't fight back? Like, do you know the effect of this on me, on my family, on my children, right? To be witnessed, to be heard, to be validated in their pain, to be acknowledged, to be apologized to be made whole, right? There are all those things, none of which the criminal legal system is supposed to do. Like, so it's not even like it's supposed to do it and doesn't do it well. It's not even among its tasks. It's not among its responsibilities. And then there's this other piece, and I say this, the best way I've been able to describe it as a survivor is that like we will feel loss so deep that we would like wring out our bones to be free of it, like from the marrow there. And we will feel fear so intrusive that in the safety of our own homes and the arms of the people we love most, we will be unable to sleep, and we will wake from that sleep with nightmares. And we will feel rage like so disfiguring that we feel unrecognizable even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, we're pragmatic. There are 2 things survivors can't stand. We cannot stand the idea of going through it again, and we cannot stand the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And so it means the efficacy of the responses to violence are as much in the interest of survivors as are those other things I described that are about the things that help a survivor form a coherent narrative about what happened that they can live with. And so both in process and in outcome, the criminal legal system fails to deliver on those things. Restorative justice on its own is not going to fully displace and replace mass incarceration. But we believe it's a critical part of a larger, like, social ecosystem that can respond to harm in a way that ends it, and transforms those involved. And so restorative justice gives you a place to ask all those questions. Like, it's the beauty of getting answers. Like, I talked to a therapist friend of mine early in this work, and she was like, "Ah, sometimes I get so sick of hearing your fucking work." And I was like, "Why?" And she was like, "I spent 10 years with people sort of talking to an empty chair or trying to fill in these gaps in the stories about what happened to them that are unknown. And you sit with people for 2 hours and they get all of it, like, because they're just there, they're just together." And there's we know that a core element of coming through post-traumatic stress is the formation of a coherent narrative, which is just a story about what happened that you can live with, like, where you want to keep living in a world where that story is true. Um, and very few people have more to contribute to that narrative than the people who caused that harm. They just know things. And so that part alone is hugely important. And then trauma ultimately distills down to powerlessness, which means the opposite of trauma isn't help. The opposite of trauma is power. And what happens in these contexts is that survivors have power to shape what happens in response to the harm they endured. And that inversion of the powerlessness that they experience in being hurt is hugely transformative and makes an enormous contribution to their healing. And then, because restorative justice produces really striking positive outcomes. So common justice since our inception have had fewer than 7% of our participants terminated from the program for new crimes on our watch. And in an analysis the Division of Criminal Justice Services in New York did for us almost a year ago now, in looking at a decade of our survivors back to 2012, only a decade of our graduates, only one of our graduates had been reconvicted of a violent offense, and that was a gun possession, not even a use. And happened at the height of the pandemic. So if a prison in the world can demonstrate those results, like, we'd be happy to go home, right? There isn't one. And so part of what restorative justice gives to survivors are these other like emotional, psychological needs. And part of what it gives is just entirely pragmatic in meeting needs for safety in ways incarceration doesn't.
So in my conversations with folks, I often feel as if they conflate or confuse accountability and punishment. Punishment is accountability. You get punished, you have been held accountable. What's wrong with that? What are the ways to think about these so that we understand that they're analytically distinct concepts?
Yeah, I think the longer I do this, I think not only are punishment and accountability not synonymous, I think they're antithetical. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to you. You are punished if you don't escape it. Accountability is active. Accountability requires that you acknowledge what you've done, you acknowledge its impact, you express genuine remorse, you make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and you do the labor of becoming someone who will never cause that harm ever again. Accountability is some of the hardest human work any of us will ever do. The only contender I know for harder work is healing. And unlike punishment, which brings no real benefit to victims, so there's not a single study anywhere that shows a correlation between the length of a defendant's sentence and a victim's well-being. So there are some studies that say victims in hearing long sentences like that at the time. That's absolutely sometimes true. The question is, does it contribute to healing? Does it contribute to well-being? When I was writing Until We Reckon, I looked at a lot of the statements that victims make at parole boards. And the number of victims who write 15, 20, 25 years later and say, I feel the same way I did on the day this happened to me. Like, my pain is undiminished. I think our collective shame for a response to violence that makes no contribution whatsoever to the person's healing, none, is shameful for us. And I think it betrays that as a nation, we do a lot of things saying we care about victims, but we don't take actions that are actually aligned with their interest in healing. A healed person, a healing person, doesn't feel the same It doesn't mean that we don't still feel immense sorrow, immense loss, even immense rage, but we don't feel exactly the same, because things that contribute to our healing help us move from that. And incarceration doesn't do it for people. Like, I think those statements are some of the most scathing indictments of incarceration that I've ever heard, even as they call for more. Like, if you had a doctor where you had unbearable migraines and you went back and every year they just wrote you a refill prescription, at some point you'd be like, this is a shitty doctor. And the fact that people are in enduring pain is not evidence that the thing we're doing about it is called for. In fact, their enduring pain is evidence that the thing that we have done for so long with so little effect on their well-being isn't serving the function it's meant to serve for them, and that we have a responsibility to do something that actually does.
So that actually, I'd love you to follow up by sharing with our audience what the outcomes are from participating in restorative justice programs or initiatives, based on what sounds to me like decades now of research and across multiple contexts. What's the difference between what happens with folks who
Yeah.
participate
So
versus?
like the outcomes are overwhelmingly positive, right? Like we have 7% failure rate for new crimes, 1 person in 10 years reconvicted of a new violent felony. You look at, there's a gold standard evaluation of Community Works West, which is a program run by what is now Impact Justice out in Oakland, that showed substantial reductions in recidivism and extremely high rates of survivor satisfaction. Our restorative justice programs just consistently produce those outcomes here and internationally. The evidence, there's not as much like gold standard random control trial type evidence in restorative justice as would probably be beneficial, but there are a lot of complications about deploying those kind of research models in this work that prevent some of it. And then there are resource restrictions that prevent more. But the trend in the evidence also seems to be that restorative justice produces better outcomes for more serious cases, which means our use of it for low-level things sort of squanders it. Like when I see people do restorative justice for little stuff, I'm like, on the one hand, if we think we're building cultural muscles, great. And on the other hand, it feels like giving people chemo for the common cold. Like we have this extraordinary tool and places where it's in great need, and we often refuse to apply it there and apply it to lesser things instead. And because restorative justice is powered by the degree of harm that it holds. Like that's what generates the accountability. It's what generates the transformation. The greater that harm, when it's done well, the more significant the results it can produce.
So you argue that one of the principles that RJ follows is racial equity. And I'm going to admit to you that I'm always a little skeptical when folks propose that programs can deal with, in racially equitable ways, some of the issues that emerge in the broader society. And so it's hard for me to imagine that restorative justice as an approach or practice has not been impacted by broader issues of racism in society. So can you speak to how the movement itself and has dealt with the issue of racism or racial disparities, et cetera? Is it not impacted in this realm? And if so, how is the movement working to address it?
So look, what I say is that responses to violence should be racially equitable, which is really different than saying restorative justice inherently produces racial equity. It doesn't. No process's application inherently produces it. I think it's really important to name that until recent history, the movement for restorative justice and the movement to end mass incarceration had very little to do with each other. Like when I started this work in 2008, I could have gone by different names in the criminal justice reform circles and the restorative justice circles and never would have been caught out, right? Like there was very little overlap between those spaces. And the restorative justice space was overwhelmingly white and often had a very like all lives matter kind of vibe. That it was a space that was sort of like we're all human, and hoped that the fact that we sat in a circle would erase dimensions of our identity, dimensions of our shared history, dimensions of power that circles don't erase. And restorative justice in many respects was irresponsible in that way and was unconcerned with racial equity. a number of people worked very hard to bring a convergence between these movements, among them Dr. Fania Davis and Dr. Morris Jenkins. They made an intervention around the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice Conference back when it was in Toledo many years ago now, and called it Restorative Justice and Race, Keeping It Real, and had speakers like Erica Huggins and Angela Davis and Tim Wise, who were not the previous speakers at that conference. I now highly recommend that conference and like what it's become over the years since like integrating that intervention into like the culture of that and what it meant about who came, who was invited, who was supported to come, who spoke, who was elevated, all of those things. But those movements haven't been like fully and completely aligned. And while I see more convergence between them than I ever have, there's still distance around that. And of course, restorative justice practices can be rife with racial inequities. They can be deployed in ways that are like highly colonial and exploitative of Native roots, that are highly performative, where people like suddenly pull out a feather they've never held before and do something in 4 directions they don't know about and claim that that makes them indigenous enough. Like they can relate like really poorly to the wide variety of indigenous roots of these practices. Who gets selected into them can be rife with bias, just like any selection process, especially out of a criminal legal system, can be rife with bias. And what happens in that space without an eye to racial equity can exacerbate rather than minimize those things. And when those spaces are held with a deep, consistent eye to racial equity, they can make a positive contribution, but it requires sort of continuous rigor, and it requires honesty about the inherent like distortions and pressures these processes experience just by virtue of their proximity to a criminal legal system that is always producing racially disparate outcomes at every stage. And so the best I know to do is to be honest about that. I remember years ago, somebody said, they called me, they told me they heard someone talking shit about common justice. Can you imagine? And I said, what did they say? And they said, you're not pure criminal justice because you're tied to the legal system. And I said, and when did they talk shit? Like, of course we aren't. I have yet to find a pure place one can stand in this nation where every inch is soaked in blood. Between like colonization and slavery and everything we did last week, like I don't know a pure place. And so we don't do restorative justice in connection to the criminal legal system because it's our belief that that's where those practices are best situated. We do that because that's where the people to whom we have committed to get free are. And so the same way, if a paramedic is doing CPR on the street, you don't say, it would be better if you did this in a more sterile environment. You're like, well, yes, we all agree. And this is where the person fell out. And the best way I've been able to describe it is I'm like, if the thing my child needed to survive was in a field of shit strewn with glass, I would walk through that field without question. And if the thing someone else's child needs to survive is a field in the middle of a field of shit strewn with glass, I will walk through that field without question. And so like, there's a reason I don't wear a lot of white boots at work, right? Like it's messy. That proximity is messy. And it has a distorting effect that you have to try and counterbalance in practice, right? And the practice of counterbalancing it is not one of ignoring it. And it's not one of escaping it. It's one of acknowledging it, of naming it, and of doing everything you can to minimize it as best as humanly possible in a process that at once is sort of separate from the whole world. Like there's something about a circle that feels like nothing but that exists while it exists, and where the whole world is there, like where everyone's ancestors are in the room, where everything everyone has ever done or seen is in the room. And in holding that balance, and I think the best way we can do that is to do it honestly and not to pretend to be any purer or more perfect than we are.
Thank you so much for that. So just for the audience, we're going to move to Q&A soon. Not yet. I have a few more questions of my own for Danielle, but you can begin to drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that we know that you are interested in joining the discussion. So I have to admit to you, Danielle, you might have shared this before in other convenings that we've been in together, but I've always been curious about how it is that common justice was able to establish the kind of relationship with the criminal legal system that allowed you to be able to move folks who were being processed for violent crime into your program with the promise that if they got through it, they would not have to experience like, how does that happen? So can you share with us how this took place so we can understand?
Yeah, the sort of longer we are from it, the weirder it seems, especially because like we took our first person into the program in 2009, started these conversations in 2007. The New York Times didn't publish the phrase mass incarceration until 2008 because it sort of marked you as like too leftist and like too strong an opinion, so we were in an environment where the idea of diversion for violence was so far from consideration. And I think mass incarceration sort of had the status that saying abolition does now, where it signals something, right? I think there were a few factors. One is that the district attorney in Brooklyn at the time, Charles Hines, prided himself as being a progressive innovator, and had done a lot around reentry, around drug diversion, sort of ahead of his time in those respects. And so he had an appetite for innovation that wasn't just not inherent. Like the notion of progressive prosecutors is a very new notion. He was sort of doing that before it was a thing, and he was imperfect in that role, as are all of us. But his commitment to that was certain. I think the second thing was that, we're an independent organization now, but we built this out of the Vera Institute of Justice, which had amassed a real credible reputation, right? Like they were known as people who didn't do crazy shit. And so when they proposed something, there was an understanding, a confidence that there was a certain amount of rigor behind the design, and that it was reasonable to expect that the outcomes they were saying would happen would likely happen, and that they would be good stewards of the reputations of their partners in the criminal justice system. And so Vera betting at the time 45-year reputation on this is to its great credit, that it did at the time. And then I think the last thing that really tipped it and continues to be instrumental in other jurisdictions is that we only take cases if the victims of crime agree. 90% do. So it excludes a very small number of cases. They do that for all the reasons I said before, that survivors benefit more greatly from this than from something else. But that provides, from a political standpoint, it provides cover for a prosecutor. From a moral standpoint, it draws on the part of them in the work that wants to serve victims and contribute to their safety and healing and well-being. And so that part of it, like the role that survivors play in moving the process forward, I think was really essential to the initial buy-in and to building continued and greater support for it over time, both through the multiple district attorneys we've had since then in Brooklyn and the people we've worked with now in other jurisdictions.
So it strikes me that because of the successes of community-based organizations like Common Justice all the way to the other coast, that because of the successes, there are a lot of jurisdictions across the country that are interested in developing their own restorative justice programs or initiatives in the context of, say, DA's offices, sometimes police departments, whatever. So are there any issues with restorative justice practices that emerge in the context of the criminal legal system as opposed to the community?
Yes, they don't belong there. Like a prosecutor's office has a very particular function. Its function is not restoration. It doesn't have an equal duty to all parties. It doesn't have an equal investment in the various potential outcomes. It is not actually, they are not lawyers for victims. Like in Turkey, the victim has a lawyer in their criminal justice process. This is what I've heard. right? That like this, there's a representative of the state, of the defendant, and the victim, with an understanding that those might be three distinct interests that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge in unpredictable ways. So the prosecutor is not even fundamentally responsible to the victim. They don't bear any responsibility to defendant other than due process, right? And to not like knowingly engage in wrongful conviction and illegal practices, right? But they don't have an obligation to that person's well-being or transformation. And their obligation to community is really unclear, right? Like what it is they do and don't owe, and how their success is measured. And prosecutors' offices are a lot of things. They are not healing venues, right? And the best thing a prosecutor's office can do is to cede its power to community organizations that are positioned to do this well. One of the things that has to happen in restorative justice is people have to be entirely honest. It is sort of ridiculous to ask a defendant to be entirely honest in a prosecutor's office. Like, that doesn't make sense to do in that context. And a restorative justice process where that honesty is constrained or ambivalent or incomplete will be damaging to everybody involved, first and foremost to the survivor. And so like, it's just important to know that prosecutor's office have an interest in securing certain types of outcomes, and there's some alignment. The best prosecutors' offices are bottom line interested in producing safety and to doing so in a way that is fair. And so they can be in like really solid alignment with the work of community-based restorative justice programs. And those offices and those programs can find places, as we do with our partners, of sufficient overlap in mission and sufficient shared interest for that partnership to be mutually beneficial to each of the things that we're trying to do. But the missions are different and the places those are situated are different. And it's one of the things that Common Justice intends to write about more in the next years as this trend emerges further and further, and in more and more places. And I think very often the prosecutor's offices where this is happening, the intention is really good. And the effect is one of co-optation, of dilution, of practices that that won't work if they are diluted. And so I also, in addition to thinking it's not the principal place for those things to be situated, I also don't think there is any reason to be confident that a restorative justice intervention situated inside a prosecutor's office or in a court system will produce any of the positive results that we've seen in the studies I've cited and all the meta-analyses in the chat. I don't think it's in any way an appropriate conclusion to expect comparable results.
So one of the many things that I love about Until We Reckon is your attention to the role that culture plays, how dominant narratives about violence, about those responsible for harm doing, about who survivors are, and about incarceration as the only viable option or solution create major barriers to imagining a way forward that centers survivors' needs, accountability, and healing and safety. I don't think that culture or the need for cultural change gets discussed anywhere near as enough as it should. So can you discuss what role you see that culture plays and how cultural shift is probably what's needed, at least in part, to help drive a move towards embracing alternatives to incarceration for violent offenses?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that like practice is constrained by policy and policy is downstream from culture, right? Like we didn't just get mass incarceration because all 50 states each passed 5 really punitive bills, right? Those bills rode on a wave of a culture change. Like I think about, you could be a first term, pretty unstrategic, inexperienced senator in a state in 1984 and introduce a bill that increased criminal penalties and pass it in your first session. Right? Like you didn't need to be great. You didn't need a multi-million-dollar advocacy campaign behind you because the wind was at your back culturally. And so we can and have to, when the culture is against the flow of where we're moving, we have to move against the wind, right? But the bigger question is, right, like what does it look like to move so that the wind is at our back, right? Like how do we change that overall orientation. Because if we invest in that, our shared resources and attention and energy, then those other things will follow from it far more easily. And when we pass things, we won't the next year have to fight to the death for implementation, and the third year fight against a rollback, right? Like those things become differently secured. And therefore differently possible to do at scale. Like there's no greater scale than narrative and culture change, right? When people talk about scaling these solutions. And so I think the first element of that narrative that we have to address is the thing we talked about, the racialized story of criminality, and the association of Blackness and criminality. Like Khalil Muhammad is not here tonight, but he is in your community at Harvard. And like the condemnation of Blackness, I think should be required reading for Americans everywhere, right? That understanding how we came to do this and what it means about who we've become and who we are and how we make meaning. And then there are the stories we tell about who is hurt, who is causing harm, and what it is that will keep us safe, right? And so we have started to do a lot of narrative change work at Common Justice that's focused on telling those stories, about uplifting the voices of survivors of color, who are far likelier to be hurt. Like while I identify as a survivor, as a white woman, I'm actually in the vast minority of who is likeliest to be hurt by crime and violence in this country. Uplifting the wide range of survivors' perspectives on criminal justice, on punishment, on healing, on all of these things, into the public narrative, pushing back on the notion that law enforcement is the inherent rightful spokesperson for survivors. Like if you want to find someone a defendant dislikes, look at the prosecutor. But if you wanted to find someone an incarcerated person hates, look at their defense attorney who didn't do right by them. And similarly, if you want to find someone a survivor dislikes, look at the defense attorney. And if you want to find someone a survivor hates, look at the prosecutor, right? Like the number of survivors who have had really negative experiences in engaging prosecution are really vast. And that doesn't mean that other survivors haven't had positive experiences. Certainly some have, but it means that law enforcement and survivors are not a single constituency. They're two constituencies, and there have to be two seats at the table. Like the survivor seat at the table can't be filled by a proxy. It should be filled by a survivor in all public conversation. And we think that's an important part of how all of this moves. We also think it's really important that as people committed to ending mass incarceration, we immediately cease and desist our common practice of minimizing violence, of saying there's less of it, there isn't that much, it's not that bad, they didn't do it, they had a reason to do it. Like none of that resonates with the people who have survived harm. And there's no one who will fight harder for a solution that actually works than people who've survived harm. So in our minimization of violence, we disfigure our own humanity in saying something is not a big deal that we should know on a core level that it is. But we also exclude from the range of people who would support, champion, speak into the public dialogue in favor of the sorts of things we envision. We exclude them from it by minimizing their experience. And so I think when we start to correct that, we start to see something different emerge. I think the last thing I'll say that makes me actually very hopeful about this is that, I said 90% of people given the option to choose common justice choose it. And that's only half of survivors call the police in the first place. Another half don't go past the first evidentiary hearing. So that 90% is among the sort of jailingest subset of survivors we know. And even there, so that 75% have already voted no in the criminal legal system through opting out, right? That's maybe one of the most damning statistics about the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of competition to be the most damning statistics about the system. And then that 90% says yes within it. But when we've asked people, survivors, like what percentage of people you think say yes? Commonest answer, 2%, 3%, 5%. So here we have people who are in a vast majority who experience themselves as outliers. That is not actually a hearts and minds problem. It's a narrative problem, right? It's people in a space where it's unsafe to be queer, presuming they're the only queer person in the room because every other queer person is also performing heterosexuality for their safety, right? So the problem is not that there aren't queer people there, right? The problem is that the space doesn't allow for the expression of someone's identity. And for survivors, the problem is not that there are not survivors who want something else. And the problem is that there is a dominant narrative that makes survivors feel weird, pathologized, isolated, different, and alone for wanting it. And then I think the last thing I'll say about it is that the biggest contributor to narrative change in our view is our ability to put forward an affirmative vision. Like, what is it we want people to move toward? You cannot predict in the absence of options what survivors will want in the presence of options. And so the presence of options becomes the most transformative piece. And I, like, one of my mentors growing up used to say, it's hard to get people excited to fight for a shit sandwich, easy on the shit. And I think very often our movement has done, right? We want a misdemeanor instead of a felony. We want 10 years instead of 20 years. We want like life without parole instead of the death penalty, right? We want all these things that are just less harm. And I believe, and what would happen if instead of fighting for less shit, and if I'm having a shit sandwich, I want as little, a thin a spread as possible, like no doubt. But like, what if we fought for a PBJ instead, right? Or what if we dared to fight for like a nourishing meal with enough that we could bring home to our loved ones who couldn't come to the table? And I think that when we start to express that vision, to center that vision, and to fight for that vision, the range of people who will join us are so much broader than the range of people who will simply fight for the reduction of things as they are. And I think our chances at significant narrative and culture change are totally entwined with our ability to co-create and express a compelling affirmative vision for how things could be instead.
So for my final question, it's hard to see the practices, procedures, or policies that are associated with the criminal legal system as anything but corrosive to communities, especially those that are targeted for aggressive kind of law enforcement engagement. At the same time, it looks as if restorative justice practices can actually help to contribute to building a sense of cohesion, of collective efficacy, of connection. Can you speak to the promise of restorative justice beyond what it is that the individuals might experience as a result of the processes that are put into place? What does it mean for community, in other words, to engage in these practices instead of incarceration and other forms of punishment?
Yeah, no, I think what you say is exactly right. I think it is generative of more than just a resolution of the case, like in the room, right? That it shifts something about power. It shifts something about relationship. It shifts something about what we believe to be possible for ourselves and others. It mends some of the rupture to the social fabric and to us as individuals that occurs when violence happens, but also that occurs through the isolation of incarceration. At its best, it doesn't ignore someone's social context. It helps someone situate themselves in a larger social context and make meaning of what happened through the dual lens of structural realities and individual agency, and holding both of those all the time, never laying one down for the other. So never pretending that it's just individual choice when someone is living in a society and a community where those choices have been so constrained, but also not pretending that even in a context of those constraints, that people don't still retain agency to make the most dignified and dignifying decisions possible. And I think restorative justice stands to do all of that. It doesn't inherently do it, right? So like anything else, like I love ice cream and there's bad ice cream out there, like just because something can be extraordinary doesn't mean every version of it is. And so I think it's also really important that in uplifting these kinds of solutions, we're also really disciplined in identifying the kinds of practices, the kinds of outcomes we look for, that we look for in assessing like what we regard as, whether you think about it as gold standard or model fidelity or deepest integrity, like however you talk about it, but where you're looking for the practice at its best. But the practice at its best stands to be extraordinary, not just in the room, but for the communities, and I think ultimately even for the nation to which like its participants belong.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So now we're going to open it up for our audience to participate. Terrence, I've seen your hand for a couple of minutes now. Sorry to keep you waiting. Would you like to ask your own question?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your thoughts today, and your insights. I have a two-part set of questions. There's clarifying questions. You've answered both of these questions already. But my first question goes to actually the first question Sandra asked. It has to do with really hard cases. My second question has to do with who else do we engage as stakeholders in this narrative change work if a prosecutor's office is not the place for it. So with my first question, let me pose the following really quickly. In 2010, I was at a national convening conference for I was at a national convening conference for the urban networks for increasing thriving youth. I was speaking with research scientists from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I said, hey, I'm really excited about this prison abolition. I did some work, was able to reduce violence in the city. I'm really proud of it. And I said, yeah, we should have one without prisons. He said, I hear you. Prisons are harmful. I agree with you. However, there's a very small percentage of people in the population who need to be sequestered and monitored. We don't know why they are the way they are. It's the wiring. But this very small percentage, very small, it's like 1/1000th of per part of the population. He said, put them somewhere, build a country club for them, give them everything they need, but make sure they're 50 miles away from anyone else, right? So in a case like that, what would you say? Like, how do we think about a world without prisons that we can live safely with people who are, for whatever reason, we don't know why they are the way they are? And with the second question, in my own jurisdiction, this is Franklin County, Ohio. I'm in Columbus. We have a prosecutor's race, and it looks like one of two people are going to win. They happen to be Black. They seem to be steeped in sort of smart on crime narrative, but how do we engage people like whoever's going to win that race, as well as others in this sort of narrative change work if restorative justice is not going to be found in a prosecutor's office? Thank you.
Yeah, these are great questions. And I think for the first one, I sort of will answer it in two ways. Like the first is, I think abolition is one of the most intellectually and spiritually demanding positions I have ever dared to hold in my life. In part, it requires that we love and have regard and care for everyone. Like everyone. I mean, even major religions all give you some people you're allowed to shun, right? Like at least you always get to come for the infidels or somebody, right? Like abolition doesn't give you even that, right? At its best. And I don't mean what abolitionists do on Twitter to one another. I don't think that's actually abolition. I think that's something else. I mean, like it's an ethos that requires that you like continuously value the dignity and humanity and freedom of each person, right? And so it would require that even in that, for those, however many people those are, that 1/1,000,000th, whatever, that we continue a rigorous practice of every time we think the only answer is isolation, to ask why, right? To ask, like, what are we failing to imagine? What have we been taught is impossible? What are ways that we could bring this person into deeper relationship? Like, what healing tools are not yet available to us that must be available to us? And that we continue to demand the rigor around that in the same way we would if we were seeking to eradicate a disease, right? That we would like get some of the easiest ones out and then we would have to keep working until we did it. And so I think abolition requires that we remain in that rigor and that curiosity, and that even when the sort of mentality of isolation shrinks to such a small number, that we continue to apply our rigor, our curiosity, our best thinking, our creativity, our all of those things in that space, and that we don't presume that everybody represented in that number needs the same thing in the same way, right? That they're inherently the same, that like what binds them to each other is that we don't know what to do, but that doesn't mean that what's needed is all the same, right? And that we remain curious about it. And part of me is like, all right, I'll give every state 10 people and we'll get down to 500 and I'll leave it to the next generation to work out the rest. Like I would be satisfied if we can get to 500 people, you know, like there were 443,850 people locked up the day I was born by my best estimate. When I said that to the researcher, Todd Clear, he guessed not just my birth year, but my birth month. So if one of you was on the call who just figured out my age from that data, please keep it to yourself. And I think we find even that number to be like wildly ambitious, right? From the 2.3 million where we sit now. And the truth is all we'd have to do for that number is not, it's not some like blank slate, imagine a new world, which is actually something, as you can probably guess, that I love to do. We just literally have to revert to the sentencing laws of the mid-70s and make them retroactive. Like it is not a huge imaginative process to get down to what would be a 75% reduction now in our practices, right? And so I think there is always a both and in it, right? There is always this question of like, how do we remain continuously rigorous in eliminating the thinking that we've been ingrained in, that constrains what we can imagine. And then also like, how do we be pragmatic and do as much as we can while we do it and constantly move in that direction, like with one another to the greatest degree possible. And then for progressive prosecutor, like for these prosecutor races, I'm very interested in them, not a surprise. And I think that the trend that I've seen nationally about what predicts a what prosecutor is likeliest to engage in the most transformative behavior in their seat, like the best behavior possible in that seat, is not, unfortunately, their talking points during their campaign. Those bear some relevance, but not too much. My hypothesis that somebody can go research, like, may I offer this project to you free, is that the biggest predictor is the constituents who elect them. So when Ken Thompson ran in Brooklyn, he made a very deliberate choice where he campaigned almost exclusively in Black and brown neighborhoods. You know, like he did enough to make sure he had the donors and the Democratic clubs and like some of the key power players. And it was a down ballot and off year, meaning like fewer voters came out. And he sort of assessed how many people he would need to win. And rather than try and persuade the already likely voters who had voted for his predecessor to vote for him, he persuaded Black and brown people in central Brooklyn who were impacted by the criminal legal system and its successes and failures to come out to vote. They had to start the campaign earlier because they had to register. Some people had to register to vote for the first time. Some people hadn't registered for 20 years, right? But that was fundamentally the base that he built. And because his constituents were comprised primarily of people who were impacted by the systems, what was risky for him was completely different. Like people in communities racked by violence and incarceration aren't kicking you out of office because of one dramatic failure in a program. Like one Willie Horton's not going to break the deal because they've seen 5 dramatic failures of people who came home from prison and 10 for people who didn't get caught. And, you know, like it's not, the standard is different. The risk tolerance is different because people are not comparing you to some idea of perfection from which like a single program failure is a departure. They're comparing you to the actual reality, and compared to that reality, you are better. And so Ken Thompson, may he rest in peace, was a methodical leader, was in many ways a little risk averse, was very ambitious in terms of his next steps in his career, and was very bold. And he was bold not because he was a risk taker or indifferent to those things, but because of who his constituents are. So I think the most exciting things around newly elected prosecutors for me are prosecutors who've been able to win with a base where a majority of their base is comprised of people who will be impacted by their work. And I think in those jurisdictions, an enormous amount of it's possible because it shifts the risk calculus fundamentally.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terrence. So Aaron Freeborn asked me to ask you, could you speak to the pros and cons of double-blind restorative justice pilot programs?
So yeah, I mean, the pros are that you get to produce evidence, you know, that demonstrates the efficacy of restorative justice, right? And that you get to do that in a way that is sort of scientifically sound and compelling to skeptics. I'll say something about that in a second. The cons is that unless you are truly in a jurisdiction where it would be impossible for you to serve all those people, and so this is the way you're deciding who you're going to serve, like where you'd be only serving 50% anyway, and so you might as well do it through a methodical way, is that you're excluding people from services and support in order to conduct the study. And you're excluding people from a process that could likely be transformative and prevent significant harm. I think that's the most significant downside. I think the other thing is that for more serious cases, almost no prosecutor's office is willing to commit to say, for example, every first-degree robbery gets restorative justice and will create a control group and a experimental group, right? Like there's not the cases in which people are willing to make a sufficiently blanket eligibility commitment in order to conduct a study of that kind are usually lower level than the cases that I think are most compelling for restorative justice or most interesting for the research. And I both like have a sort of obsession with good data. I think it's interesting and valuable and all those things. And I think very few people change their minds based on good data. There's been good data about restorative justice for a very long time. And data doesn't beat narrative. Data doesn't beat fear. Like if you have a kid and he says there is a monster under his bed and you say, baby, there's a 98% chance there's not a monster under your bed, ain't nobody sleeping that night. Like that's not how it works. Like you do something else. You say, how do you know the monster is mean? How do you know the monster is scary? Could you talk to the monster? Here's a magic wand. Here's a walkie-talkie to call me if the monster comes, right? Like you inject curiosity, you propose solutions, you don't just combat it. And so for us, we have not been sufficiently persuaded that, like we went 6 years where we only had one person terminated for a new crime, right? And it's not like y'all saw a national watershed from that extraordinary result, right? And so I think there is a way in which we need so much more evidence. We need so much more data. We need to be able to go sort of round for round in those things. And we also, prisons have a failure rate of 85% by their own most important measures, and that's been irrelevant. And so I think we also have to be careful about placing too much hope in what positive data will produce.
So one of the things that I've been wondering, Danielle, is how you'd respond to some of the critiques that are leveled against restorative justice practices. So for instance, there are some who say that many survivors are kind of pushed to participate, and not that they want to, but there's also the social pressure to do so, and so they do so for that reason, that there are a lot of power dynamics that don't actually serve survivors, etc. And so that's just one. Can you speak to that critique and maybe one or two others that get frequently leveled against RJ?
Yeah, and I'm also going to turn on a light because it's grown dark in New York since we started talking. Just like I realize I'm receding into darkness, and it's not because I'm avoiding these questions. I think some programs do and have manipulated survivors and been interested in them only in an instrumental way. In the same way the criminal legal system calls, in New York, survivors are called complaining witnesses. If that doesn't tell you what their role is in the system, I don't know what does. The criminal legal system on the whole typically uses survivors as instruments to secure convictions, and restorative justice programs have used survivors as instruments to secure people's release. Like that's just true. And it's important that our movement is honest about the fact that that's been true, and that when that harm has occurred, that we're committed to repairing it. And so I think there are times that critique is legitimate, and I just don't think it's always legitimate. I don't think the social pressure to participate outweighs the enormous social pressure to seek punishment. I think in terms of the balance of that, I think we always have protection in choosing punishment in this culture, right? Like it is always a protected position. At Common Justice, our outreach, we do not persuade people that they should do common justice. We ask people, first we tell them what happened to them is wrong, that we believe what happened to them is wrong, unequivocally. We don't say, oh, but it could have been worse. We don't say, oh, do you know he's been through a lot of trauma or whatever. We just say, and if they say those things, we say, he still had no right to hurt you. And then we ask them what they want to see come out of all of this, like for themselves and like with respect to the person who hurt them. We ask them what of those things they think jail and prison will produce. And then we tell them what we do, and we ask them of their own list, which of those things do they think our process will produce? And the 90% who choose yes because more of the things they want, they judge will come out of our process. And so we're really clear, for us, we consider an outreach successful if we believe a survivor's made a fully informed decision. So including if that's a no, and our survivors are still entitled to all of our wraparound services, even if they say no to the responsible party participating in the program. And an unsuccessful outreach for us is one in which a survivor is not fully informed, right? Where we can't get them to engage in conversation for any number of reasons. And so, yeah, I think that critique is in some respects fair. And I think it's important that we're honest that that has been a pattern in. I am back.
Okay, excellent. Welcome back.
I said some very smart things while I was frozen.
No question about
it was really the best of the night. Where did I lose you?
Good question. But you thought it was fair. The criticism.
That some of that critique is fair. I think we've talked about the critique that it's sort of soft on crime and why that's silly. And I think that the last critique I think is really common is that people think that people can sort of game the system. They can sort of pretend to be remorseful and they really aren't. And I think it mistakes what restorative justice is. So maybe it's worth it to say at the end of this time what I think it is, having talked about it all this time, which is a process in which the people directly impacted by harm come together and reach an agreement to address that harm and reach agreements about how the responsible person can make things as right as possible. And so it's important to me that to name that definition doesn't include the expression of remorse, the feeling of remorse, right? And so many, many years ago when I was designing this project and was working with young men coming home from Rikers, one day someone came up and asked me, like, it was like, Ms. Danielle, what do you mean by accountability? And first I looked to see if there was like a candid camera situation, because like my greatest dream is that a teenager asked me to define accountability, so I thought someone was like setting me up. But that day I was impatient and I was in the middle of something, which I'm not proud of. And I turned and really quickly, I was like, accountability is doing sorry. And we still talk about it that way. Like that accountability isn't being sorry or feeling sorry or saying sorry, but doing sorry, right? Well, what is a course of action that accountability looks like? What does repair look like as a thing that you do? And so I think it's important to say that because it means that the measure is not like just looking into someone's eyes and checking whether you think they're really speaking from their heart, though usually you can tell that too. The measure is much more in people's actions, which are both transformative to the people engaged in those actions and deeply believable to the people witnessing them.
Well, I want to respect your time because I know that you have a baby to get back to. And so we're going to wrap it up now. For those of you who have questions that you weren't able to ask, please do send me an email and I will shoot those to Danielle to answer at a later date. I cannot thank you enough for joining us for our 5th event. This was just extraordinary. If others haven't been as moved as I am by what you do, then something's wrong with them. But really appreciate you very much. Thank you for joining us. And hopefully we'll see each other again soon.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sandra, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for being with us this evening.